The Duke of Verewood had read the clause 3 times before she walked in, and 3 times it had tasted of iron in his mouth. Marry the Hartley girl within 90 days, or forfeit Verewood lands his family had held for 4 generations. He had come to the solicitor's office expecting to find a frightened companion clutching a reticule, a woman he might pity and pay off. Instead, the door opened on a slender figure in grey who looked at him without flinching, and then looked at the document on the desk as though it were the only thing in the room that mattered. "Your Grace," said the solicitor, rising in a flutter, "may I present Miss Tessa Hartley, late companion to your aunt, the Dowager Countess of Marwood." The Duke inclined his head a precise degree. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with a face that London had learned to fear at gaming tables and in the House of Lords alike, a hard, still face that gave nothing away. He waited for her to curtsy too low, to stammer, to weep. She did none of these. She sat, smoothed her skirts, and folded her hands. "I should like to read the will aloud," Tessa said quietly, "if no one objects." The solicitor blinked. "Miss Hartley, the terms have been explained to you." "They have been explained to me. I should like to read them. A thing one is bound by ought to be a thing one has spoken with one's own mouth." She lifted the page. Her voice did not shake. The Duke found, to his own surprise, that he was leaning forward. She read the whole of it, the strange, willful instrument his aunt had drawn up in the last spring of her life, that her companion of 7 years, Tessa Hartley, having neither fortune nor protector, should not be cast upon the world penniless. That her nephew Marcus, Duke of Verewood, brooding and unwed at 35, should not be left to rot in his great cold house alone. That the 2 of them, within 90 days, should marry, or the lands of Verewood would pass to a distant cousin, and Tessa would receive nothing at all. When she finished, she set the page down and looked at him. "My aunt," the Duke said, and his voice came out lower than he intended, "had a great fondness for arranging the lives of others." "She had a great fondness for you," Tessa answered. "She spoke of you nearly every day. She said you were kinder than you allowed the world to see, and lonelier than you would ever confess." A pause. I did not contradict her. I had no evidence either way. Something moved behind his eyes. He smothered it. "You understand what is being asked. You are being handed to me like a deed of property." "I understand it perfectly." She'd not drop her gaze. "Which is why I shall not be handed. I will not be a clause, Your Grace. If I am to be your wife, it will be because I choose it on terms I have named, not because a dead woman's pen pressed me into your house like a seal into wax." The solicitor made a small sound of alarm. The Duke raised one hand and silenced him without looking. "Name them," he said. And so she did. Tessa Hartley, who owned nothing in the world but a trunk of mended dresses and her own steady composure, named her price to the most powerful man in 3 counties as calmly as if she were ordering tea. "First," she said, "I will not be married in haste and hidden away. If we wed in your own chapel, before your own people, and you will stand beside me as though you are not ashamed. Second, I will have the keeping of the orphan school your aunt founded in the village, which I am told has gone to ruin since her death, and you will fund it properly, without my having to ask twice. Third," here, for the first time, something flickered in her voice, quickly mastered, "you will give me 1 year. 1 year in which either of us may walk away and forfeit the whole inheritance, lands and all, if we find we cannot bear the sight of one another. I will not bind you for life to a stranger, Your Grace, and I will not be bound. Love that is forced is not love. It is only a longer kind of imprisonment." The room was very still. The Duke of Verewood had been negotiated with by chancellors and creditors and the mothers of marriageable daughters. None of them had ever offered to hand back the prize. He looked at this grey, plain-spoken woman who had just made it possible for him to lose everything, and felt absurdly, for the first time in years, that he had been seen. "You would risk Verewood itself," he said slowly, "to keep your freedom." "I would risk a great deal," said Tessa, "to keep my own soul. It is the only property I have never had to mend." He stood. He crossed to the window, and the afternoon light fell hard across the plains of his face. For a long moment he said nothing at all. "Agreed," he said at last. "All of it, the chapel, the school." He turned. "And one term of my own, Miss Hartley, since we are naming prices. You will not pretend in that year to feel what you do not feel. I have had enough of pretending faces about me. If you cannot like me, you will tell me plainly. I would rather be refused honestly than flattered for an estate." For the first time, Tessa Hartley smiled, a small, surprised, wholly genuine thing that altered her whole face. "On that," she said, "we are perfectly agreed." They were married 11 days later in the chapel at Verewood, before the tenants and the servants and the curious gentry of 3 parishes, and the Duke stood beside her with his head high and offer his arm down the aisle, as though she were the finest thing his house had ever held. The year began. She did not pretend. That was the thing he had not expected, that he would come to wait, all through his long brooding days, for the hour when she would say something true. She told him when the soup was too cold, and when his steward was cheating him, and when his temper had frightened a housemaid to tears. She rebuilt the orphan school stone by stone and brought him there one wet afternoon, half against his will, and he stood in the doorway and watched her kneel in the mud to lace a small child's boot, and something in his chest came quietly, irreparably loose. In the evenings she read to him. He had not known he liked to be read to. He had not known a great many things about himself until she came into his cold house and began, without ever raising her voice, to warm it. He learned the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. He learned that she hummed very softly when she believed herself alone, and that she stopped the moment she saw him, and he learned to come into a room slowly, so as to hear a few bars more. He learned that the grey dresses were not poverty alone, but a kind of armour, and one evening he came home from the city with a length of deep green silk over his arm and laid it before her without a word, and watched the colour come up in her face, and thought he had never in his life made a wiser purchase. He did not tell her what was happening to him. He had given his word she should not be pressed, and he kept it as he kept all his words absolutely. But the year wore on, and the day drew near when either of them might walk away and forfeit everything, and the Duke of Verewood, who feared nothing on this earth, found that he was afraid. It was Tessa who spoke first. It was the eve of the day. They sat by the fire, and she had let her book fall closed in her lap, and at last she said, not quite steadily, "Tomorrow the year is ended. By the terms I named in that office, either of us may go." She did not look at him. "I have come to think those terms were the wisest thing I ever did, and the most foolish. Wise because they made this house a place I entered freely. Foolish." She stopped. "Because," his voice was scarcely above the crackle of the fire, "because they require me in the morning to choose, and I find I do not want a year or a chapel or even the school if I cannot have." Again she stopped and pressed her lips together and made herself finish it honestly, as she had promised she always would. "If I cannot have you, Marcus. Not the lands, not the contract, you." The Duke of Verewood rose from his chair. He crossed the hearth and knelt, this hard and feared man, on the floor at her feet, and took both her hands in his. "Then hear my term," he said, and his voice was rough with everything he had held back for a year. "I do not want the inheritance. Let the cousin have the lands, the house, every acre of it, if that is the price. I will not have you wonder, not for 1 hour of your life, whether I kept you for Verewood. So I lay it down, all of it. I choose you with empty hands, Tessa, so that you will never doubt the choosing." He bowed his head over her fingers. "You named your price in that office, and I have spent a year discovering my own. It is only this, that you stay, not as a clause, as my wife in earnest, freely, because you will it. Will you?" The fire snapped. Her hands turned in his and held him fast. "You would give up Verewood itself," she whispered, echoing the words he had once said to her, "to keep me." "I would give up a great deal," said the Duke, lifting his eyes to hers, "to keep the only thing in that will I cannot bear to lose." And it was never the land. She came down from the chair into his arms, there on the warm stones before the fire, and he held her as though she were both the most fragile and the most certain thing he had ever possessed. He did not kiss her at once. He only drew back and looked at her, truly looked, the way she had taught him, and let her see, plainly and at last, the whole of what he had hidden behind the hard, still face the world so feared. And then, gently, he touched his lips to her brow and to her cheek and at last to her mouth, and the year of waiting fell away from them both like a coat too long worn. They did not lose Verewood. The aunt, it transpired, had drawn a quiet codicil her solicitor had been instructed to reveal only if the marriage proved true and freely chosen, and it freed the lands entirely, with the Duke's own blessing left to bind them. But neither of them ever spoke much of the lands afterward. What they spoke of, in the long warm evenings of all the years that followed, was the grey-clad woman who had walked into a solicitor's office to be handed over like property, and had instead read the terms aloud in a steady voice, and named her price, and so won the one heart that had never before been freely given to anyone at all. She had refused to be a clause, and in refusing she had become the only term he could never bear to lose.